we are returning to our top story for today's perspective. Negotiators are continuing to work out the final details on the agreement that will see at least 50 hostages freed from Gaza and allow a pause in more than 6 weeks of fighting. Our guest for perspective is lawyer and researcher Johann Soufi. He is also a former senior legal officer with the UN. Thank you so much for coming into studio this morning. Johann, firstly, there's obviously still a lot of uncertainty around the terms of this deal. Firstly, are you surprised that it has been delayed now by a day?
I mean, the delay, I don't know, because I don't know the underlying political game there. But I'm surprised that it has been delayed so long and that it has needed so much suffering on both sides before reaching an agreement on basic humanitarian needs, both for the hostages and for the population in Gaza.
And if there is, let's talk a little bit about the temporary truce, because that was also part of it. It's not just about releasing hostages and Palestinian prisoners. If there is violence during this temporary truce, if it's broken by Hamas or others, what can Israel legally do there? Is this likely to be part of what is being negotiated as part of this deal? What happens if there's a breach in the truce?
Well, I have to remind something first, is that, the humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip has never been subjected to the question of the hostages, legally speaking, because there is an obligation for all the parties to a conflict to allow humanitarian access, food, water, and it has not been done before. So in terms of humanitarian access, that does not change anything whether or not there is a breach in the truce for this access. Then in terms of the agreement, the gentleman agreement that has been made between the parties to the fight, then yes, actually there would be an authorization to react to a breach of the truce.
And in terms of the humanitarian access then, if we just have a 4-day truce, pause in the fighting, what kind of a difference is that going to actually make on the ground to people in Gaza?
This humanitarian truce is a drop of humanity in a shadow of darkness. So that will not change a lot. That's still a bit of a glimpse of hope, but you've seen the pictures of the Gaza Strip. I mean, the humanitarian needs are enormous, and so 4 days won't change so much because you have a lot of sick and wounded in the hospitals in the north. You have a population that has been deprived of water, food for weeks now, and so yes, what we need is an actual ceasefire.
Do you think, though, at this stage there's any hope that we're going to see that in the short term?
I'm not a political analyst. I'm a humanitarian and a lawyer, as you said. So I need to keep the hope and to advocate for it, because I don't think there is any long-term military solution. I mean, this humanitarian disaster just perpetrates a cycle of violence that has been ongoing for decades in the Middle East.
And we saw Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, yesterday. He was referring to what he said was a clause in this deal that's going to allow the Red Cross, for example, to have access to the rest of the hostages, the ones that aren't going to be, unfortunately, released as part of this deal. Now, the Red Cross is not aware of that being in the deal at this point, but do you think that is something that is necessary, that we need to see humanitarian access to the people who are still being held hostage in Gaza itself?
Yes, that's not only necessary, but that's a legal obligation. And again, a legal obligation that pre-existing this agreement. I mean, this has been a legal obligation because of the Geneva Convention from the very first day of the conflict.
But do you think that's something likely to happen? We're not even sure where exactly these hostages are being held currently. Is Hamas likely to allow that to happen?
Well, I don't know to what extent Hamas has still a possibility of coordinating their communication, whether even all hostages are being held by Hamas. I mean, only they know. and perhaps the ICRC to some extent knows some of them, because the ICRC has plays this role in many conflicts, and that's why also they need to remain impartial and totally neutral. And I see some criticism sometimes online again what the ICRC, the position that they are taking, but that's exactly their role, is to access hostages and to visit prisoners also on both sides.
Well, let's talk about the prisoners on the other side then, because the deal, as far as we know, will allow for the release of Palestinian prisoners. What do we know about the kind of conditions that they are being held in currently?
Well, I just referred to some human rights organization statement and to UN reports. It seems that the condition of detention have been quickly degrading, especially since the 7th October. And I also remind that some of the detainees are detained under so-called administrative detention without the basic human rights being guaranteed, the right to a lawyer, the right to know the charges, etc.
And what is your view? We've heard a lot of accusations being directed at Israel since the start of this war, accusing it of war crimes. The South African president, the latest to do so this week. What is your view on that?
It's clear. It's clear. There is a clear disproportionality in the attack right now. And the mere fact to deprive an entire population, an entire civilian population of water, food, medicine, and basic humanitarian needs constitute a collective punition that is prohibited under international law. So, in other words, a war crime.
And earlier this week, some of the families of those who are being held hostage in Gaza, they urged lawmakers in Israel not to pursue legislation that is aimed at making it easier to use capital punishment. Is such a measure, isn't it likely to further inflame tensions if that is what is going to be used against Hamas militants if we look further down the line after this war?
Yeah, from the beginning, the reasoning of revenge, the mindset of taking revenge for past crimes has always been what has fueled this conflict that has been ongoing for decades again. So, yeah, I believe that any violation of international law or human rights will fuel the conflict of tomorrow.
Finally, then, what is the future governance of Gaza as you see it? Netanyahu, again, ruling out the likelihood from his perspective that the Palestinian Authority will have any role there. What do you think needs to happen in the future in Gaza?
What I think is that we have to respect the Palestinian will. I see a lot of international players who are deciding for the Palestinian people. I remind that the Palestinian people have a right to decide of their own fate, which they have been deprived for decades now. So the only future I care about is international justice on both sides.
Johann, thank you so much for coming into studio to speak with us this morning. That is Johann Soufi, a lawyer and researcher, and also you were former senior legal officer with the United Nations.